in the recent years, they have been pretty chaotic, pretty polarizing. We have witnessed to extremely contentious presidential elections, 2016, 2020. We have witnessed the January 6th insurrection, George Floyd protests, war in Ukraine, the pandemic. Many people often loosely throw around the phrase, this is the worst it's ever been. This is the most troubling time in human history. We spoke about all these historical events you've lived through. Of course, your parents have also lived through World War II, the Holocaust as well.
Exactly.
I think you're the perfect person to ask this question. Is this really the worst period in human history, or do you think we're still relatively much better off?
Well, I can't speak of human history because I can't go back to the period of the bubonic plague or the barbarian sacking the Roman Empire and the Dark Ages. So I can't draw that comparison. And I think that there is a tendency to privilege what's happening now and feel like because we're living through it now, this must be the worst. And in some ways, it is a more dire moment than any I've lived through, and I'll get to that in a second. But as you said, my parents both grew up in the Great Depression, and particularly in my mother's family, they were really living hand to mouth. When I wrote a book about my mother, I found out that my grandmother, when her husband, my grandfather, was out of work for months and months and months at a time, would literally go and pick garbage to, get sort of spoiled food or partly spoiled food out of garbage cans to make sure the family got fed. The 68, the year we were talking about before, the assassination of Dr. King, the assassination of Bobby Kennedy, the police riot against anti-war protesters and journalists at the 68 Democratic Convention. That was a year when it did feel like things were really in some ways spinning, out of orbit for this country. And, for my kids who are now respectively in their late 20s and early 30s, their coming of age was the September 11th attack, living at a time of rising Islamophobia and hate crimes against innocent, minority communities in this country, the Great Recession. So that was some of what affected them. But I do think that what's really different, and I especially experienced this as a nonfiction writer, about the Trump era is the war on truth itself, the war on factuality itself. When I think back of the Vietnam War years and the turmoil in the country, or I think of the Watergate scandal under Richard Nixon, because the news industry was a lot more concentrated then, 3 major TV networks, a few major national magazines like Time and Life that would circulate 20 million copies apiece, major not only national newspapers like the New York Times, but big influential regional newspapers like the Chicago Tribune or the Louisville Courier-Journal. I didn't have the sense then that there were different vying versions of truth out there. I understood that there were different analyses and interpretations of what the facts were, but I didn't feel then, in a way I do unfortunately feel now, that there are actually 2 versions of what reality is, one of which is real reality, and one of which is a dangerously manufactured false reality, which is nonetheless clung to by a large number of people in this country. And there's a famous line from Daniel Patrick Moynihan, a longtime senator from New York and a great public intellectual, who said, everyone's entitled to their own opinions, but nobody's entitled to their own facts. But that's been proven false in the Trump era. There's this sense that you can invent your own facts, and they're as good as what objective, provable, demonstrable reality is. And so in that respect, it's a much more dangerous time than any that I've lived through. I remember how much being in college, in particular, a very left-wing campus at the University of Wisconsin in the Nixon years and Watergate years, the utter contempt we all had for Nixon. But I don't think anyone thought for a moment that Nixon was going to turn the country into a dictatorship, even at his worst. And that's a very real risk with Trump. And of course, the attitude about journalists from then till now is like polar opposites. When I was taking journalism classes in college in the mid-'70s, if anything, there was too romantic a view of journalists because Woodward and Bernstein and all the president's men and my journalism classes were filled with people who thought, wow, I'm going to get famous and be a hero is to become a journalist. And of course, people like that didn't stay with it. But now it's 180 degrees different. And people who become journalists, my students at Columbia who work in this country, I'm not talking about going to be a journalist in a dangerous place like in the cartel-controlled areas of Mexico or in Russia. I'm talking about in the U.S., they have to think about, will I be physically attacked? Yeah. Will I be doxxed? Just how do I get reality through to people who don't want to receive it in the form of my article or my broadcast? And so that's what's definitely more treacherous than anything in my 67-year and 10-month lifetime.